Today I want to talk about Nightwings by Robert Silverberg. This edition I picked out because I probably should stop blabbering on about this, but I was going to do an event, a September event about reading short books, but I'm just doing short books on my own and not attaching myself to the event anymore. So I picked out a couple Robert Silverberg novellas in these editions. I believe this is Wildside Press. You can see it was a Hugo Award winner. It's a novella. You can see that here. I'm going to pick out some better covers later because I have some particular things I want to discuss. But very quickly, it is a very lyrical novella about a far future decadent in a aesthetic way, civilization, thousands of years in Earth's future, with a caste system where there are different castes that are responsible for different things in society. For example, watchers who can not astral project, but remote view into space. They see that a invasion is coming, or an alien force is coming, an alien presence of some kind is coming. Then there are people who are flyers who can travel up through space, or at least up to the edge of space. And there are defenders who have to be warned about this possible invasion. In a way, it reminds me a bit of the Dancers of the End of Time trilogy. If you know those books by Michael Moorcock, far future, they're a bit laid back. Maybe the movies are at odds too. It's set in Rome. Early on, there's a discussion of why would anybody want to invade us? There's nothing here but old ruins, and we don't have anything anymore, and we're just kind of spinning out. We don't have any treasure, any resources, or anything. Why would there's nothing to invade here? And it's very well written. It's, like I said, more lyrical than Silverberg's work that I'm used to. It won the Hugo Award. It's very well written. It was nominated for the Nebula Award. The Nebulas are awarded by the Science Fiction Writers of America, so it's a professional organization where the writers nominate the work of their peers. The Hugos are a fan award awarded at the World Science Fiction Convention every year by fans. And the reason I mention that is during this era particularly, and I guess now too, any era, there is quite a bit of overlap. It's very common for a book to be a book, or in this case a novella, to be nominated for both awards and to win one or to win both if it's really good. So that's kind of a normal situation. Here is... And another normal situation is that when a novella reaches that kind of notoriety in science fiction back in the old days, the writer would inevitably turn it into a novel. It was just, required, because you have the cachet of winning the award, for short fiction that doesn't really pay off in the marketplace, and at the time they didn't really publish mass market novellas that much, and killing me. So it was made into a workup. There's a fix-up novel. There's two ways to do fix-ups. What Silverberg did here is the I think the most common way, which would be to write two more novellas, then sort of stitch them together, which probably wouldn't be that hard to do because he knew he'd be doing that by the time the first one became so notable. Another way to do a stitch-up is to add in subplots into the narrative. It really just depends on the book and the approach the writer decides to take. Whether they can extrapolate on the story or whether they can expand the story. Like there's one by Michael Moorcock called Son of Man, which I haven't read in a long time, so I don't want to talk about too much. But and that was one where I had read the novella and later read the novel. I'm sorry, I didn't. But I was able to guess, I think, where the expansions came from. It's about a time traveler who gets mistaken for Christ, or perhaps is Christ, depending on how you want to interpret it. And you can see that the really intense, well-written parts of that book, and the other parts that were probably just sort of shoehorned in to give that time traveler some different adventures. So anyway, this is probably the original novel version, which would be Nightwings, the story I'm talking about today, plus its 2 sequels, all set in that world. And you can see the kind of cover that it was given originally. This was published in Galaxy Magazine, 1968. 1968. I have, and I think this is one of the print covers today. It's an Open Road reprint ebook. Then it's gone through many editions because it's a very popular book. However, it appeared originally in Galaxy Magazine in 1968. And I want to show you this because this is really the point I'm trying to get to. Eventually, look at the other stories in here. Find the Face by Ross Rocklyn. I don't know that story, but Ross Rocklyn was a well-known writer of the time, not as well-known anymore, but he had definitely, I think he might have written, don't quote me, but he might have written the first Hugo-winning novel, or co-wrote it. There were 2 people who wrote it, I think, called They'd Rather Be Right. If I'm wrong about all that, who cares? Then Nightwings. Then The Listeners by James L. Gunn, which probably was nominated for the same awards. I'm not going to look it up, but that is James Gunn's most notable work, and he later turned it into a novel. At the bottom, you can see they were also running a serial, Spectres Haunting Texas by Fritz Leiber. The reason I want to point that out is here are 3 classics in one issue of Galaxy Magazine in 1968. Spectre of Haunting Texas is not Fritz Leiber's greatest book, but it is a very well still respected book and still in print today and beloved. James Gunn was most known for The Listeners. He was not a very prolific writer. He was more of an academic, but he did have his day. Nightwings we discussed. So there's four authors in here. I don't know if there's maybe others that aren't on the cover, but I think these books were about 160, 180 pages. Nightwings was probably pretty long. These are all pretty long stories, so these might have been the only 4 in there. And so what a feast in one magazine, one of the 5 or 4 or 5 at this time digest magazines, F&SF, Analog, and Galaxy. I guess that's only 3 at the time. And when you go into old bookstores or whatever and look them up from this era, this is what you see. You see a cover full of names that you still know today, of books that are still in print today. It was a very, very rich time in the history of science fiction, the 60s and 70s. Now I want to bring in... I recommend the novella. It was interesting to read it. I'm glad that Wildside Press is putting out these original novella versions as standalones, rather than just what we've had for most of the time was just the novelized versions. Because they are fun to read this week. Just read it as its own thing, the way it was originally presented, would have been presented to the science fiction readers of Galaxy in 1968. You'll see the covers go through a lot of different iterations, but all summer and maybe longer, but definitely all summer, all through Rocket Summer, and influenced very much by Outlaw Bookseller and another channel I'm going to talk about more in a minute. I've been thinking a lot about science fiction and why the science fiction of this era is so great, in my opinion, and why the newer stuff doesn't appeal to me. And this week, just a few days ago, Grammaticus Books put up a video. I don't remember the name offhand, but I will put it in the comments, of course, talking about this very issue of why science fiction today doesn't have the same sort of feel, and why the bookstores, if they have science fiction in them at all, anything at all, they're filled with reissues of the old classics, and it just doesn't feel the same. It doesn't hit the same way. I've tried it many times. I'm not going to recap his video or anything, but you should definitely watch it if you're interested in science fiction. And if you're not interested in science fiction, you don't know what you're still doing here. But he brings up a lot. He brings up a lot of ideas. It's based on an earlier video he did about the fantasy phenomenon that started with Tolkien and that really took off when Terry Brooks' The Sword of, I'm going to say it wrong. I'm going to say it wrong on purpose because that's how I learned how to say it. But The Sword of Shannara. That's a book that I struggled to read when it came out. I felt like I should want to read it. It just did not appeal to me. I never got past chapter 1, but I kept it around for many years. Wanted to read this big brick because I was not really I'm not even that much of a Tolkien fan. I respect Tolkien, of course, but as far as fantasy goes, I like, and I've said this many times on the channel, I like the working man stuff. I like Conan. I like the barbarians and the bullies and the mercenaries and the thieves and that kind of fiction, and not the holders of the silver chalice of destiny kind of people. You know, in the middle is kind of Moorcock, whose work I love very much too, because he has the concept of the eternal champion, which is this broad, bigger hero's journey kind of concept. But the way Moorcock approaches it is on a very a more visceral level, I guess. I don't know. I don't want to get too far off on the fantasy. Because anyway, Grammaticus makes the observation, makes a set of observations about the field of science fiction and fantasy, which are grouped together, and they have always been grouped together in America and in the marketplace for whatever reason. I guess probably because they tend to appeal to the same type of person. You know, most people who read science fiction read some form of fantasy. Some people would even argue, and many people have actually argued, I wish I could think of the names of them, but many people have argued that science fiction is a subset of fantasy because it is speculative, it takes off from science, but it has to go beyond the science we know, and usually to get good stories you have to go beyond the science that is possible. Let's be real about this. Most of the stuff that happens in science fiction is not scientifically possible, and it's even pretty impressive when you read a novel that everything is scientifically possible. Then it comes, almost back into the realm of like techno thrillers and all that. So, and I commented on Grammaticus's SF video. It's like, this is, oh my God, I can't believe you said all this and did it so well. And it is, on that video, after you watch it, is really worth going through the comment section, because you will see many very long, thoughtful, intelligent comments from many different booktubers and science fiction fans saying, concurring, co-signing, and very thoughtful comment section he's got going there on that video in particular. So don't miss that if you're interested in watching. You should watch Grammaticus's video. If you haven't already, go back and read the comments. because a lot of people are thinking the same thing. It's just become obvious maybe over the past few years, at least on BookTube, because they're maybe in part have to give Michael K. Vaughan some of the credit, because Rocket Summer, Michael K. Vaughan's events usually are very popular. He's very good at thinking of great events and enthusiastically allowing anybody to come in and join in, and it's fun for everybody. But Rocket Summer goes from the 30s to the 80s through the 60s, and I was mildly bitch that it should really go through the 70s, because there's so much great 70s science fiction, which is another reason I was glad to see Grammaticus talk about the 60s and 70s as a set. Again, the two channels to follow about this, the main channel to follow about all this stuff is Outlaw Bookseller. He has got a vast wealth of knowledge about science fiction, and he talks about other stuff too. He talks about outsider fiction. He talks about music, but he has so many great videos on the new wave era, for want of a better word. Oh, I guess that is the word. But as I was, and I wrote a comment of the same thing as everybody else. Yes, this is great. This is what I've been trying to put into words for so long on Grammaticus's video. And then as I was typing, I came up with the concept. I put out the concept that what if, and I just did it just as I was typing it. It never occurred to me until I watched Grammaticus's video. What if we're looking at science fiction? What if there's a better way of looking at this era of science fiction as more of an artistic movement, a broad-based artistic movement? And there are two kinds of artistic movements, as far as I can tell. There's a small group get together and start one. That would be like the pre-Raphaelites, who were artists and poets who felt that it was kind of neo-romanticism, who felt that European art took a wrong turn after the time of Raphael, or at the time of Raphael, and that they should go back. They should ignore stuff that had been done in the previous century and go back to that other term. So that's one kind of artistic movement, where they have a manifesto and stuff. Another kind of artistic movement is something that's identified later, and I would compare it to the Impressionists, the Impressionist painters. Are now a group. Originally, they were just all the people painting at the time, or all the people that were trying to do new things and experiment with new techniques. But now we think of them as a set group of painters. Impressionism is a school of art. And now if you're doing that, if you're doing it today and you're doing it well, or even not well, you're painting in the Impressionist style. Or you're a neo-impressionist or something like that. So I'm sure if you look up Impressionism, you'll see like some dates, many names. And if you go deeper into art history, the history of time, you'll see many, many, many more names that are not considered among the greats today. I'm talking about like people like Monet and Manet and others. I'm not an art historian. It's just the only way I can think to compare it, or this idea I'm just formulating about maybe the age of science fiction. This one or two generations of writers that started out in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then started the ones that are still alive, and many of them are still alive today. Silverberg's still alive today. His career changed very much in the 80s. Shockingly so to me, because I was kind of bummed out. Because I had read Silverberg, I had just discovered his 70s work, which was so cool and lean and spare. I think probably the first one I read was The Book of Skulls. Michael K. Vaughan has a good review of that he did this year or last year. Maybe I'll link to that if I think of it. And he was writing, he started in the 50s. Silverberg did. He's a very talented. Forgetting, even leaving aside his science fiction talent, he's a very talented entertainer. Let me put it that way, because he started out writing for money, as they all do, as many do, and he could write. For example, he could write a 4,000 word story before lunch, and then he could write another 4,000 word story after lunch, and send them both to pulp magazines and sell them. And at some point, these are things he's talked about in the introductions to different books of his that I've read. I won't be able to track them down and reference them, but take my word for it or don't, it doesn't matter. Then some of the writers that were a bit above him, maybe Randall Garrett or people like that. Sorry, I should have put the pause on for that. Started talking to him, saying, hey, you're kind of wasting your talent. You can do much better than this. And so they saw that in them as professionals and as people who cared about the quality of writing. Said, up your game, dude. And he did. And then he wrote the books the books I've been talking about, Nightwing, his books of the 60s and 70s, where he started winning awards and became one of the most respected writers of his generation. And then around 1980, the market started to change quite a bit, and he changed with it. And he wrote a trilogy of books, science fiction books, but very much fantasized books, and it was called Lord Valentine's Castle. He came out with that just as trilogies were becoming a thing because of Lord of the Rings, and then publishers started to try to force everybody to write trilogies. Thomas Covenant, who's that's another fantasy trilogy of the time. Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever by Stephen Donaldson. Another book another trilogy I couldn't finish. So it was like, and Star Wars was such an influence on the writing world as well as the film world, and probably not to the best effect, but Star Wars was such a juggernaut in the world of pop culture. There's a movie called White Dog, directed by Samuel Fuller. He actually came in and took it over after someone was, so it was not his project. Samuel Fuller's a great B-movie director. This is a later movie. It's about it's an independent film. Stars Christopher McNichol and Burl Ives, and was it Burl Ives? And oh man, I'm gonna mess all these names up. Doesn't matter. It's a really cool movie if you see it. It's about a dog that is been trained to attack black people. It's a racist dog, and because it was trained in a very cruel way to hate black people by some previous owner. We don't know anything about it. Is it Paul Winfield? I don't want to get the name wrong. It's that great actor who was in Sounder, and then he later played a very memorable episode of Next Generation, Two Off with him and Picard. What the hell is that guy's name? He's also in Wrath of Khan. Paul Winfield, I was right, so I don't feel bad now. Anyway, he plays an animal trainer. He's an African-American animal trainer who takes on the challenge of retraining this dog to not want to kill black people, which he has been told is an impossible task. Anyway, boy, I got really off track here, but it's such a cool movie. So he is determined to do it, and he is an expert animal trainer. the most of the movie takes place in this movie ranch where they train animals. And I think it's Burl Ives is the owner of this ranch. And anyway, there's a scene on there where the owner of the ranch, it's a ranch where they rent animals and rent them out for movies. Yeah, like they do with horses in the more recent horror movie Nope. And so they're going to use this ranch, and Paul Winfield's going to retrain this dog, cure it of the evil training that it got when by horrific methods when this dog was tortured as a puppy to make it hate black people by some Klansman or something type person. But there's a scene in there where Burl Ives is complaining about movies and modern movies, and this is the late 70s, and he's got a cutout of R2-D2, and he throws a rock at it or a dart or something. He goes, "That is the enemy," meaning to his business, because he's making movies with animals, and now they're making movies with robots. So it was a big deal. It was a big change in the industry. Suddenly we went from the time of spaghetti westerns and cop movies and all that to the world of science fiction. And it was not a guarantee. Star Wars, the original Star Wars movie, whichever we're supposed to call it. I'm not going to go into that fiction. That's charade. Episode 4, New Hope bullshit. Star Wars is the first Star Wars movie. Was done in a way, Lucas had a backup plan, which was the story that became Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which was the first standalone Star Wars novel written by Alan Dean Foster. That was his backup plan, to finish the story with one more cheap movie. But they really didn't expect it to be that much. Lucas's original idea was to purchase the rights to Buck Rogers or Flash Gordon and make that his big science fiction movie. Somebody's signaling me. But it was such a big hit that everything became science fiction all of a sudden. There was like Close Encounters and E.T. and all this stuff came out, and there was a lot of cheapy movies at the time, and it really changed the direction of science fiction. Reading science fiction sure brought in a whole new audience, because people thought this is what science fiction was now, and it's this is an old debate. The old editor of Analog, I saw him on some documentary about science fiction and film one time, and he said it's not science fiction, it's science fantasy, which is fine, but this is what people think of as science fiction, action-based wars, World War II in space kind of stuff. And that's fine, but that's what people started to want more of. Whereas the science fiction that I'm talking about, the science fiction from the 50s, 60s, and 70s, was not that. Star Wars harkens back to more the 30s and 40s, Captain Future and things like that. Science fiction is more like Star Trek. Star Trek being science fiction light, very light version of science. At least the earlier series is where they would do science fiction plots, but they would also do a lot. They simplify them, and they turn them into a serial format where you could have the characters go from week to week, having different adventures. Meeting very strange cultures, not as strange as you're going to meet in written science fiction, not by any means, and not be particularly affected by it, which I think is a key thing in science fiction. the great science fiction is the world has to be changed fundamentally for the characters. To me, science fiction that I'm talking about, I'll call it you can't call it the golden age because there is a golden age. You have to call it some people call it the new wave, but there was many great writers writing throughout that new wave who were old masters who did just as innovative work. Grammaticus mentioned Paul Anderson. There's Frederick Pohl. All these people were still writing too. They were not part of the new wave per se or anything, but they still had these brilliant ideas, and science fiction was often called the literature of ideas. I don't think you could call a row of Star Wars novels, and this is catty, I guess, but you go to the book rack at Barnes and Noble, and you see a bunch of Star Wars novels and romanticy and stuff, and you wouldn't say, well, there's the literature of ideas. That's not Star Wars isn't really breaking ground on science fictional ideas. That's not what it's for, and I really haven't watched much of this stuff. I've only seen the first three books, but 3 movies. I didn't see the prequels and I didn't see the sequels, and all I know about them is that everybody hates them, but they still go watch them, and they seem much more like and then the series that have been out, like the Mandalorian and I almost said Anora, which does sound like a science fiction. It does sound like a Star Wars plot, doesn't it, Anora? But or whatever they are. But I've seen clips of them and all that, and they seem like westerns, or they seem more like westerns or samurai stories, that kind of thing. Adventure stories, which is great. I know people love that stuff, but and I love it too. But I go back to the older stuff. I go back to westerns and private eye novels and Lost World novels and that kind of stuff, because I'm old. And I do wonder if, part of my feeling about why was that science fiction of that era so good is maybe it's just because I'm old and I don't like the new stuff. But if so, there's a lot of people feeling the same way. And I really do think it has something to do with the time. I think it would be hard to recreate that now. Several things, like Grammaticus mentioned, was the budgets. Like fantasy was selling better, and not just to put it all on the publishers, but like I was talking about Silverberg. No one forced him to do a big pseudo fantasy trilogy, and those books are pretty good. The Lord Valentine's Castle are pretty good. They just didn't really hit me the same way, and maybe he just went into a different phase of his career that happened to coincide with the rise of fantasy and science fantasy. But that Lord Valentine's Castle trilogy is pretty good. I think it did very well for him. I think there were some nominations there too. It's set on a giant planet, a huge, massive planet that is sustains human life despite being massive, because it has low gravity, because it has very poor mineral, whatever you call it, it doesn't have a lot of minerals, so it doesn't have much industry or anything, and it's set in the past, but it's very much a medieval world that these people live on, who are obviously descendants of human colonists from centuries and centuries ago. It's really a two-part novel, with the middle book being composed of short stories, which was brilliant, because how many trilogies have you read where the second book is just a filler? It doesn't have a beginning, doesn't have an end. I mean, I think writers are better at it now, but so he got a trilogy out of a 2-book thing. Like, here's the first half of the epic story, and then here's a bunch of short stories that kind of build out the world. There's about 5 different races on the world, I think, besides humans. And those are some excellent stories in that book. And then back to finish the story. So he knows what he's doing. That's Silverberg. And then since then, his books have been more, historical based. He wrote books about Gilgamesh. He wrote science fiction that is more rooted in classical history, and he was always interested in that. The next book I'm going to read by him is from '72 or something. It's called Born with the Dead. It is based on the myth of almost said Oedipus, Orpheus and Eurydice. So it's about resurrection. Then NIGHTWINGS original copy. Then look what they're putting it out as a few years later. This is the same novel. This is meant to appeal to the fantasy audience, and the Nightwing characters are ethereal, and you could compare them to magical fairies kind of thing. So that's the direction the field went, and most people are satisfied with that, I believe. Here's another fantasy type version. Definitely earlier than that other one. You would not put a book out with a cover like that today. But you can see this guy is like a priest here, looks like a Gandalf type character. We'll get her out of the picture. And that's how it went. So I think there were several factors to Grammatica's point. I think it was the market, the budgets for the publishers went towards fantasy, which led the writers to go towards fantasy. But sometimes the writers would lead on and transition to fantasy. Or another writer who did the similar thing as Lord Valentine's Castle about the same time was Samuel Delany, who did a fantasy quartet. I think there are four. The Naviriona books, which he calls fantasy, but at his core, just like Silverberg, he really wrote science fiction even when he was writing fantasy. There's almost no fantasy elements in the Naviriona books. The fantasy is that it takes place in an ancient world, not the modern world, a prehistory world, a world that's more like Samaria or out of Conan or something, as it's prehistory, but it's really based on actual human history. So fantasy lands, made up countries, made up names, made up cultures, but there's really no magic in it. And there are even discussions about inventions. Like I remember in the early book, someone invents the corridor, meaning a way to get from room to room inside a house, as opposed to like an ancient Roman house where it's an open garden in the middle, and then you go to each room around the garden. And there's a dragon or two here and stuff like that, but it's really like science fiction, because what happens in Naviriona stories is you're exploring the culture, not exploring the adventures of somebody trying to on some dragon quest or something. There used to be before Tolkien, the thing was people wanted to write fantasy had to disguise it as science fiction. So you've got The Dying Earth by Jack Vance. They're fantasy stories set far in the future where the magic, but there's no magic. It's replaced by this technology that the people using it don't understand, so they think it's magic. Same, I believe, with Anne McCaffrey's books, the Dragon, her Dragon Saga. What are those books called? I haven't read them. I really should read those. But they're set on in a future world on a planet that has dragon riders on it. Dragon riders of Pern, the Pern books. So it's got all this fantasy iconography, but the world building under it is science fiction, because it's, again, a world populated by humans that is on a different planet, far from here, and in the far future. So As usual, I forgot half my points. I guess they weren't important. Another thing that I think contributed to this change when the publishers realized you can make a butt ton of money with fantasy was just when the reading populace of the United States and the rest of the English-speaking world made it known that they prefer fantasy to science fiction. I'll tell you what I've learned from doing videos this year. Science fiction is not a popular genre. When I do videos about anything else other than a science fiction book, they do way better. Those are my least popular videos. I still do them because that's what I want to do. And I think they'd probably get more views if I were totally focused on science fiction. But if I put up two videos, and one is about a 50s private eye novel and one is about a 50s science fiction novel, I can tell you for certain which one's going to do better, which one's going to get more views, and that means more interest. But I like both, especially now. I'm really getting back into SF from the classic era because there's so much of it I didn't read. I mean, I read tons of it, but there's tons more. There's a whole list of writers I never got to, and now they're just such a joy to read. For one thing, all the books are short and punchy. They get to the idea. They get the ideas out there. You don't have to read 50 of them. You know, if you, I have a friend who did not read he reads all fantasy, but he did not read the George R.R. Martin books yet. He's waiting for them to be finished. He doesn't want to start it till it's finished. He's been waiting a long time. So he's never going to read those books, which just save him a lot of time. But, you know, these series that go on and on, 10, 20, 30 books, big-ass books. I don't know why fantasy lends itself to that more than science fiction. I guess you could do that in science fiction. They kind of do it with Star Wars because they have these endless series, adventure series, but I think it's what people want, and I just think that the audience for science fiction was always smaller. It's like the audience for philosophy. I don't want to overstate it, but I think science fiction is a kind of a philosophical, of the kind I like, the kind I'm talking about. Not the adventure stuff, and I love old Star Trek as much as anybody, and I love, just straightforward adventure fiction as much as anybody, but when I'm talking about science fiction, it is it is written in a different mode, and it is best enjoyed in a different mode. It is about the ideas, not the characters. It's not about subplots. It's not about romantic subplots. Romance can play into it, of course, but especially if it's a story about, which has a theme of human sexuality, something like that, then romance might play into it. Silverberg definitely has stories like that. There is what the hell's that book called by Silverberg, who Thorns. Thorn is a book set a few centuries, many decades from now, in which the civilization, the Earth civilization, is expanded throughout the solar system, but not farther. There is a reality show. Most people are into entertainment. This is written in the 60s or 70s, around 1970, and it is dark. It is there's these two people are selected because of their hideousness and made to have a romance together as a reality show, so the whole galaxy can watch it for their amusement. That's not going to play as a fantasy trilogy. That's not going to play as a romantasy. That is a dark book that has a lot to say about humans and the way we behave towards each other. And It's not a crowd pleaser. And so these are the things that these kind of books appeal to. So I can see where most people, if they're not looking for that, if they grow up, and most people grown up, most people around now, their first their first impression of science fiction is Star Wars, or if they were raised right, their first impulse of their first introduction to science fiction would be at least Star Trek, but I'm just kidding. So that's what people want. It's the trappings of space opera. It's the lightsabers or the things like that. The cool technology, the spaceships, the total disregard for distance. In the best science fiction, even the best space opera, they have to deal some way with time dilation. The fact that if you're going faster than light, you're going to how are you going to get back to the time that you came from, because you're so far because of the theory of relativity. So you have to figure out a way around it, but then you have to figure about what your way around it does, or you could just ignore it like Star Wars does. They just zip around, and Star Trek does pretty much. They all have the same star dates. They don't have time dilation. Does not exist in the Star Trek universe. You just go wherever you want. You come back whenever you want. And they have a few words like subspace and everything, hyperspace, that they use to wave over these things, but because they want to get them out of the way so they can have the adventure. That's. In a book, people don't all speak English. When they meet them, people don't all have the same scale. They're not all 6 feet tall kind of people. You could do much more of that, and they're doing more of it in Star Trek now, but not everyone can write science fiction. That's the other thing, and many people have tried. Lawrence Block tried. He says, I love reading it. I can't do it. It's a special skill. It's a specialized skill. That's why some science fiction writers fail to write anything else, and why others, for example, Jack Vance, who I talked about recently, one of his non-science fiction books, his books, or at least the one that I've read by him, he's got others, their non-science fiction books feel different. They are able to write in other modes. They just keep coming back to science fiction because they love it, or they have ideas they want to get out of them. One of my favorite science fiction books is by Jack Vance, and it's about language. It's called The Languages of Pao, P-A-O. And it takes place on a very high level, kind of like the Foundation trilogy, but even more so. There's this planet, and people want to get it under control, so they decide to create languages, and they will give different languages to different groups in order to direct how that group behaves. So, like, they have a certain type of language for the warrior class, a certain type of language for the priest class. By limiting what people can talk about, and limiting the sounds they can make and things like that, they force them into different directions. But you could make a 30-volume trilogy about that, how it affects each individual and all that. But it isn't. It's on the macro level, because it's just the idea of, you had this idea about language. He was studying language, I suppose, at the time, and thought about how just the words you're given, just the grammar you're given, just the sounds you're given are going to affect you in a certain way. But it goes into nothing about how these languages are imposed. If you went down to the individual level, there'd be civil wars, and there'd be people trying to speak other people's languages. But that's not what he's interested in, and that's the kind of thing that science fiction can do. Which is telling this story about what would it be like if there was a culture where the languages are all artificial. It's like a 150, 200-page book, and it's thought-provoking. but it's not going to be a series because I don't even know how well that book did at the time. I think it was pretty well received critically. But science fiction is more of a specialized thing, and I think it just ran its course. And that's not in to denigrate anything that's being written today, but I am a person who's tried very hard to get into new science fiction because I still do write some science fiction adjacent stuff and all that. So I read all the magazines, and mostly I can't make heads or tail of the stories, or they're extremely, extremely woke, which is a whole different can of worms. But they're written more for the longhouse. They're written more for the crowd. Like look how virtuous I am that I can talk about this stuff, and there's a lot of that on the short story level. There's a lot of stories that read very nostalgically, like there was a story a few years ago in Asimov's that kind of in Asimov's Science Fiction magazine, which is a bi-monthly newsstand magazine, and you can get copies too. It's like Ellery Queen, but for science fiction. It's named after Asimov, much the way Ellery Queen's magazine was named after that character and Alfred Hitchcock, what have you. But there was a story a few years ago in there about it was set in the 1950s, and these kids are at drive-in. These kids are on a date. These kids are on their dates on the drive-in, drinking cokes and doing all this kind of stuff. And then they see this weird couple of kids, and they swear they see a jalopy descend from the heavens. And they're like, I think that car wasn't there. I think it dropped from the sky. And then they investigate, and they find out it's some teenagers from Mars, not Mars, but it's some teenagers from some other planet that get together, and they dress up as humans, and they go watch a movie to pretend they're humans in the 1950s, and the point of view characters don't mess their secret or anything. But that story was published in 2015 or something, and it's nostalgia. It is a type of story that you would see on the Twilight Zone, which is fun, but it's not pushing. It's the point I'm trying to make is there's nothing pushing the genre forward. There's a lot of nostalgia in those magazines, in the more traditional ones. Stuff that could have been written 50 years ago, but wasn't, and wouldn't have changed the world if it had, and then other stuff I mentioned, and just it's very hard to come up with new ideas. It may be another thing that may have affected this was the limits of science. It's when science fiction started in the 30s and earlier, in the Hugo Gernsback era, kind of came out of radio magazines, like magazines that were talking about the inventions that were coming. This is the era of flight. 1914, no one had ever flown in the history of humanity. Well, I guess balloons, but hot air balloons. But no one had ever flown a plane before 1911. And by 1918, planes were devastating the world, and even by 1941, forget about it. This is like just hell from the air, like giant steel ships and massive bombs and nuclear weapons. Everything you could imagine was invented, and people thought it would just keep going. The ships in the 30s. Starships in the 30s in science fiction would be atomic powered and things like that. These were all things that were on the horizon that all came about, for better or worse, mostly for worse. But airplanes, and we go to the moon by 1969. Despite what Candace Owens said today on her show, we actually did go to the moon. Several trips. People say, well, Do you believe in the moon landing? It's like, it's not the moon landing, it's the moon landings. They would have had to fake, how many was it, 6 landings, and fake 1 aborted mission, Apollo 13, just to get the ratings up, I guess. I don't know. Anyway, you can go, there are satellite pictures from other ships, like from Chinese craft and Russian craft that have circled the moon since then, where you can see the lunar lander on the moon. So anyway, I don't know how I got off on that. It's stupid. Don't be that stupid. And I believe a lot of conspiracies, but don't be that stupid. So you go from 1911 to 1969. That's not one human's life. That is, I'm 64. 1911 to 1969 is 54 years. 2 years longer than Philip K. Dick lived, and he died very young. 54 years, 2 years, the same age as Shakespeare lived. You go from nobody's ever flown a plane to people landing on the moon. So at this time, there's great optimism about science and where we're going to go, and we're going to go to Mars, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Telescopes were more powerful, so we saw that all these other planets were not livable, not even close to livable, not like in the 30s what people thought, like, well, Mars is probably a dying world where we'll just get some pumps and we'll build canals down from the ice caps, and then we'll set up our cities, everything will be fine. Or we'll go to Venus and we'll kill all the dinosaurs that live in the jungles of Venus, and then we'll be fine. So we know there's nothing. You could build. Then you have things come in like Ringworld, and different things were based on new technologies that people came up with, where there'd be L5 colonies where we build these artificial colonies, or even eventually have a Dyson sphere, which would totally encapsulate the sun, and so we could take all its energy and live on this massive, massive interior world of a Dyson sphere. And that kind of stuff came in. It's very cool. Allowed people to continue. But there was a problem of physics that it's really started to become very clear. There's no way around this, the reality speed limit of the speed of light, which really messes things up. I mean, you could have generation ships that go a long ways, but it's limiting. And so I think there was some kind of, and the space program kind of stopped because America won the race, and then that was really only what was pushing it was the Cold War. To us, watching it as a kid or whatever, you think it's just exploration for its own sake. But we find out in later years it was really just to rub the Soviets' noses in it for creating the first satellite, for putting Sputnik into place first. It was really a propaganda ploy to go to the moon, and look what we did. And whereas people, ordinary people never thought of it that way. They just thought of it was the next step. But politicians always have their own plans for us, and so they started putting the money into other things. And it would have been a much, much more difficult thing to go to Mars than to the moon, because the moon only takes 3 days to get to, compared to like a year and a half or something to get to Mars. It's quite a different calculation. So there was that. There was, and I still think about this a lot. I read a lot of astronomy books when I was a kid, like we all did. I mean, I'm sure if you're still here, I don't know anybody who's still here, but we read a lot of astronomy. The show Cosmos was a big thing when I was a kid, the Carl Sagan show. A few years ago, I found this little book. It's still out there. You can still get it, which is not useless. It's a pretty good book by, what's that guy's name? Who's the modern day Carl Sagan? I mean, he shouldn't be in the Dyson. Anyway, who's that astronomer who's always on TV, always on podcasts with a mustache? Neil deGrasse Tyson. Duh. Okay. Well, I'm gonna, in my own defense, I'm gonna say I just was talking about Dyson spheres, and the names are similar, so I didn't want to. Didn't want to make them mix them up. Neil deGrasse Dyson. Neil deGrasse Tyson is a the famous guy who's on podcasts talking about science all the time and complaining about the canopy and Titanic and stuff. But I read his little book on astronomy, which I thought would be a really good way to just see what's been added to knowledge since the 80s, when I was more into reading about everything. And there was really nothing. There was nothing in the book that I didn't know about. So we've come up against some walls in terms of physics and astronomy, because we spend all of our time mostly on trying to make smaller and smaller chips to make faster and faster devices to play with. And that's where the focus on science is. And so I think at a certain point it became even more ridiculous to the layman, to the average person. The tropes, the traditional elements of science fiction became just too unbelievable. I know many people have a visceral dislike of science fiction. They think it's really stupid. They don't get it. And part of it, I think, is the way it's written, where it's really about the ideas. It's like, there is a common language, especially of that era of science fiction, because it was a small group. If you go look through the Hugo nominated writers, and this is true today, but it's a different group, and Nebula nominated writers, it is a small group. That were doing the work that is still remembered today, and it's the same work that was most praised at the time. There's not a lot of forgotten science fiction writers in the way that there's forgotten Victorian writers, say. Well, no, I have to take that back, because of I've learned that from watching Outlaw Booksellers videos. There's quite a number of writers who really never got their due when they were alive, and don't get their due now. D.G. Compton, others that probably should have been better known at the time. However, we have a couple of classic programs like Gateway SF and the Glance series, and science fiction still has a very dedicated, classic science fiction still has a very dedicated fan base, spearheaded on YouTube by Michael K. Vaughan and Grammaticus and Steve Donahue and Outlaw Bookseller and many others who just love this old stuff, and the other stuff doesn't do as much for them, and so it'll always be around. But I think it is really just a set. I don't think we can expect another new wave of science fiction. I think cyberpunk was the last thing. As I've said on here before, I really never got into cyberpunk very much. I like Bruce Sterling a bit, but it just seemed like a downgrade from the stuff of previous generations. Even though it was coming out right at the time I was coming into early adulthood. So you'd think that would be the stuff I would like the most, but I was already old-fashioned then. I was going back to the classic Michael Moorcock and Philip K. Dick books and Harlan Ellison anthologies and things. I talked about that on one of my other long videos. For a tag video I did, I talked about what I learned from reading Dangerous Visions and again Dangerous Visions, which was not really much about, was not the best collections of stories. There are many, many better ones, like A Treasury of Great Science Fiction, that 2-volume that 2-volume book set, or the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, which is 3 volumes. The first one has to do with short stories. The next two is a 2-part volume that has to do with novellas, which probably are the most fertile. I was going to say genre, but the most fertile format, whatever length, I guess is the way to say it, for science fiction is like 20 to 40,000 words. You get the ideas in there, you get the ideas across, you blow the reader's mind, you open up a whole new world to the reader, you change that world fundamentally, and you get out, and then you write another one, and you get another great idea, and you write that. So I probably just talked about it way too long. Who's going to listen to this? Why would you listen to this? If you're still here and you're not subscribed, I have to be a little harsh on you and say you really should subscribe if you sat through this 66-minute video. But those are my thoughts on Silverberg's novel Nightwings, novella Nightwings, Grammaticus's brilliant video on the state of science fiction and the era that we're talking about. So I just wanted to get my own thoughts out there to you. What the hell? It never hurts. Put your own thoughts out there. That's what we have YouTube for. Thank you and good night.